So welcome everybody to this panel on freelancing. I'm so excited. Thank you to both of you for doing this. I'm Whitney Dangerfield. I'm the publications director here at the Journalism Institute. And I'll just do a quick bio for both of you to introduce you. So I'll just go at my top. Beside me on the screen is John Surico. So John is he's a senior fellow for climate and opportunity at the Center for an Urban Future. And I see it's Adrian has gotten on for a second. Okay, that's fine. And as a professor at the Journalism Institute, he writes regularly about cities, their streets, spaces, people, challenges, and opportunities. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Bloomberg, Hellgate, Vice, the Wall Street Journal, Curbed, Guardian, and MIT Tech Review, among several other publications. And he also studied journalism. He studied journalism at NYU. And then Felipe De La Hoz is a contributing member of the New York Daily News editorial board and a professor here at the Journalism Institute. He writes for a variety of publications about politics and immigration. His writing has appeared in The Intercept, The New Republic, The Daily Beast, Baffler, The Appeal, The Nation, Hellgate, City and State, and other publications. He also studied journalism at NYU. And I guess, were you both in classes together? Did you know each other
I
back?
think I'm a couple of years older than Felipe, but I did see and visit him in class when he was still.
Yeah, we actually met with when John came as a guest to a one of my classes, and we kept in touch since. So it was kind of funny, to be now kind of both here.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I always feel like I read your sort of a brief formal bio, but I'm curious how you would describe stories about how you got to this point in your career, because I feel like the way that you tell it is probably very different than what you may put on your a LinkedIn profile or something. Felipe, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, so I, was sort of one of the lucky people who was very aware of more or less what I wanted to do from a pretty early age. I sort of got interested in photography when I was in my teens. I was living in Brazil at the time, and I kind of by happenstance ended up in some of the Confederation's Cup riots that were happening in this would be like 2013, I think. And or 2012. And I kind of was there the day that protesters overran the Brazilian capital, which is an image you don't soon forget. Anyway, I sort of decided I really wanted to do journalism. I ended up at NYU, and started freelancing even while still in school. So I started writing for the Village Voice. Back when it sort of existed in its prior form. It's sort of a little bit different now, but during my probably junior year of school. And then from there, I mean, really a lot of my career has been sort of downstream of having developed a beat around immigration and sort of, certain expertise there and writing for various outlets kind of about that. And sort of, becoming a sort of a go-to person in for a certain type of coverage, which is, I'm sure, something we'll be touching on a little bit later in this panel. But and now I'm sort of on an editorial board, which isn't exactly what I had targeted, out of school, but it's interesting and sort of also indicative of just the way things kind of, pan out. And, you might end up doing something that you didn't necessarily think you would, but it's interesting work and sort of all that. So anyway, now I'm, full circle, happy to be back teaching here at my my alma mater with John, of course.
Yeah. And I definitely want to talk about creating a beat. And that's my next question. But John, how do you tell your story of how you got to where you are now?
Let's think about the 12 years in a quick couple sentences. No, so I mean, like, I feel like I was kind of in this Obama era, kind of, really got interested in the media and journalism during the Obama years, and really got interested in Washington at that time, and kind of came to NYU. I was part of my high school newspaper, was kind of into reporting and writing, loved history, loved politics, kind of fell into that. And then when I showed up to NYU, I actually really grew in love with the city, because I felt like the city was way more tangible in terms of what I could write about. Like DC politics just felt very far away in a lot of ways. So So I kind of fell in love with the city, ended up writing a lot about Bloomberg because he was the mayor then. And, I kind of fell in love with this idea with, cities having to act quick because they can't really wait for Washington. And we've really seen that happen in the last 10 years. And then when I graduated, I was also freelancing throughout my time. I worked at The Voice Next Door, just like Felipe, was contributing to a couple different outlets, and then kind of fell into, the first available jobs for me were all breaking news jobs. So I was running all over the city, focusing a lot on, just everything under the sun in terms of what was breaking then. So that was like crime, the Pope visiting New York City, like a fire, anything like that was happening. I was doing a lot of breaking news at that time for the New York Times and for the Wall Street Journal, and also covering the 2013 campaign for mayor. And at that time, it was a really fun race with Anthony Weiner and Christine Quinn and a quiet candidate named Bill de Blasio, who ended up taking it in the end. And then over time, I kind of developed a beat around crime and criminal justice. This was around the time of the kind of beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, and the police killings that were just kind of enthralling the nation in so many ways. So I was writing a lot about that, and mass incarceration. And then I kind of switched to writing a lot for Vice at that time because they were really interested in these issues. And they kind of allowed me to explore a couple of my like own curiosities. I think a bit different than Felipe, where I knew what I was interested in, but it took me a little bit to get to the beat that I've dedicated my career to now. I had to like fall first and realize what I didn't like, and then kind of get around to eventually what I did like. So the real nail in the coffin for me with national politics was covering the 2016 presidential campaign, which was like truly a memory that I'll never forget. But I realized that I'm just like not cut out to be a campaign reporter. I'm not cut out to be a national politics reporter. And I just found, again, in the end, the city to be way more interesting. So I kind of came back, told my editors at Vice that, and then they gave me the job covering the New York City subway, which became my beat for about 3 years. And then after that, that just kind of opened a Pandora's box, and I've been covering cities and urban planning, got a degree in urban planning, and it kind of just like became obsessed with that for the like latter half of the past decade. But it took a while to get to that point, right? Like I had to figure out, like I liked criminal justice, but really at the end, I liked how New York City was doing specific things, not so much the more national conversation around it, or at least myself as a writer on it. So it was a bit of a topsy-turvy way to get to what I ended up liking, which was really cities and how they dictate policy.
And I want to talk about beats, but I do want to ask quickly, what do you remember what your first published piece was when you were in journalism school? I guess you both were freelancing, started getting published when you were an undergrad. So do you remember what the first thing was?
I remember mine. I worked for the Washington Square News when I was in school, and I do recommend that. I tell people that having clips anywhere is essentially, really paramount. It's very important to have published work. I don't want to discourage anyone from, getting good grades, and trying very hard in school. However, I will say that, that is, almost pales in importance when compared to kind of the ability to show that you have done work on deadline that's been published. And so I was working for the Washington Square News. The first piece that I really published in sort of a major outlet was in the Village Voice, and it was actually a piece that I was working on for a class. I honestly don't recall which class. It must have been like the Beat or Advanced or something, where it was a slightly longer piece, and it was about this community activist who's still around. Her name's Alicia Boyd. She was at that moment very involved in sort of rezoning in Prospect Lefferts Gardens. And I honestly don't recall how I came to know of her or whatever, but I was sort of visiting her and I was writing this piece. And actually the way that I was almost like a poster child for like, NYU journalism. Like the way I sort of ended up having it be published was that I met the editors of the Village Voice at one of the career fairs that NYU had. And I was, I think it's very important in settings like that, like the career fair, and like whenever you kind of meet people, to just sort of not like, you're immediately going to pitch them on your story and like really like push hard on that, right? You want to kind of, introduce yourself and everything, but like, just sort of talk about the work you're doing, right? And sort of, see if there's a spark or if they can offer advice and stuff. And so they said, oh, that actually sounds kind of interesting. Obviously we cover a lot of stuff around kind of city movements and gentrification and these things that the story kind of involves. And so why don't you pitch us? And so, I did. I sort of like sent them a summary of the story, and I ended up, kind of doing that as my first story for kind of a bigger publication. And so, that was, kind of a genesis of also kind of just gaining some confidence. Also, like I've now published something in sort of a major outlet, the Village Voices storied institution, et cetera, et cetera. Like kind of, feel like I got the ball rolling. And so that was something I published probably like my junior or senior year of college.
That's great. I mean, yeah, I love that you are the poster child for the journalism program. What about you, John?
I've been thinking about it since like hearing about, I think there's a kind of underreported story of how many NYU journalism students at that time were published by The Voice when they were really active, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
Was really exciting at the time, especially they had like Running Scared, which was their news blog, and they were just like, yeah, doing great work and publishing a lot of students, which was great. I'm trying to think. I had this like ongoing role. So I think a kind of important note is like using your internships when your jobs are to like transcribe to like also pitch them, right? And you have your ears there. I had this internship senior year, which was truly bizarre for what I wanted to do, but I was an intern at GQ, just because like I don't know anything about men's style at all, and I told them that when they hired me. But I like really wanted to get published on the website, but I didn't know what I could fill as an intern because it's a magazine, so it's a bit different. And I pitched reviewing Saturday Night Live because I love SNL. I'm a huge SNL fan. And like they did a lot of stories at that time. It was like Kate McKinnon and the kind of like last all-star cast. And they were like, yeah, we'll pay you to review SNL every single week. But that meant I had I like didn't realize when I pitched it that meant I had to basically wake up at Sunday, every single Sunday at like 6 a.m. and watch the entire episode and have a review done by like 9 to be up on the website by noon because that's when people are reading it. So yeah, a bit of a devil's bargain there, but yeah, covered SNL for over a year, and it was one of my first like ongoing series for a major magazine's outlet. But it would be on the homepage when it would go up. And they don't do anything like that anymore. And it was kind of this really random opportunity. But it like those jobs plus the kind of Village Voice and these blog jobs just got like made me really good. And I don't know if Felipe, you could speak to this too, just like writing really fast, which is a huge part of freelancing, or being able to write for the speeds that you're being asked to write for.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, watching the episode at 6 a.m., writing a review of it by 9, and doing that, having it all done in a couple of hours, it's something that trained me really well for being able to do that in different ways in breaking news later on.
I mean, that sounds like a dream. That dream
it
sounds
was a
like a dream role. That sounds
it was
great.
a great job. It was very fun watching it, getting paid to watch SNL. I mean, like, yeah, it was a lot of fun.
And so let's talk about beats. I mean, you both have a beat, and I feel like, how I think that some students want to have a beat or they don't know how to go about like finding it. And it's interesting that you said, John, that you had to like sort of find out what you didn't want to do. But how important do you think finding a beat is for a writer? And then are there like, so that's sort of the upsides, but what are there any downsides to it? Do you feel like you're sort of then people think of you only for this one type of thing, but maybe that's not a bad thing? Can we just like discuss that a little bit? What do you think, Felipe?
I mean, yeah, I'd say that, obviously there's always a risk of getting pigeonholed. And I mean, I will say people switch beats all the time, right? And you see this particularly within publications, right? So and so is covering, education, and then they switch to cops, and then they do that, so it's not necessarily, I think that I sometimes say that the ability to develop a beat is in itself a skill. And what I mean by that is there are kind of like meta skills that come attached to it. So it's like quickly developing sources and understanding kind of the roadmap, and maybe like the almost like the sort of branches of an issue. So who's the decision maker? Where do you go to find information? What sources are you subscribed to? Who are you calling? What do you know about the sort of the underlying policy, and like, the personalities and the disagreements and the institutions. And so developing that kind of an expertise is in itself an expertise almost,
Yeah.
And so I think it's more important really to be able to do that as a practice than it is necessarily to like whatever, your beat happens to be at any given time. Now, I mean, for me, I would say that for the way that my career has panned out, having a beat and having the beat that I had was somewhat fundamental. I mean, which isn't to say that, if I hadn't done it, I wouldn't have had a career in journalism. It would have just been a very different type of career. And I know that there are folks who like being generalists and want to kind of be runners or whatever, and there's nothing wrong with that. I do think for me, it was a really important part of my development as a journalist. In part because, I sort of like really made it a mission to really understand the mechanics of an issue that aren't often very well understood, right? So, I cover immigration, detention, policy, adjudication, and it's like this. I joke with people that it's an issue that there is kind of almost inversely proportional, like the amount that people know about it versus how strongly people generally feel. And so it's a very, very emotional issue, but most people don't really understand sort of the basic mechanics of it, like regulatorily and policy wise and stuff. And so even just knowing that, and especially as, it became kind of cyclically like a major national issue, which, for example, like under Trump, right, it was often kind of the main national story, which, definitely like it helped me that sort of this thing that I had dedicated so much time to learning was sort of so in demand. And so, and that again is a double-edged sword, because there are periods where it isn't as in demand, right? There, like, the focus shifts elsewhere, and like all of a sudden your work maybe dries up a little bit more, versus like sometimes it's like you can't stop fielding calls, right? And so I think it's important also to understand that that dynamic. But writ large, I think having a beat, even just having something like a particular expertise in something, really gives you a leg up, because there's a built-in advantage that you have versus anybody else that is not replicable, right? Like, if there's a story that editors want to write about X or Y, and you're the person who knows about that, they're just going to call you, because I mean, what the alternative is, like calling somebody maybe that they've worked with before or are more comfortable with, but they just are going to have to get up to speed in a way that you don't. And so it's really a massive advantage. And I saw there's a question here about like whether it's good to have a versatile beat, and I think I think like it's very good to have like something that you're known for, and like if you want to kind of switch things up, as I mentioned, I think like having the ability to create a beat is in itself sort of a skill. And so, as long as people know that you're good at it, right? That you can like find the sources, that you can talk to the people, that you can sort of understand the issues. I think like it shouldn't like limit you in the sense of like, be a full pigeonhole that you can't get out of.
Yeah, and I want to hear from you, John, but I also think, like sometimes a beat could be immigration policy, but like sometimes, in my opinion, like it could also be like the human story behind the news or something. So it could be, it doesn't have to be so,
Sure.
you can think of beat in a more expansive way too. It's interesting, John, I think that you said that you were like, well, this isn't my beat, but maybe this is my beat. And like that gives, I think lots of people hope to like help them like be like, oh, okay, I can find this. And so can you tell us about how it worked for you?
Yeah, I was thinking, Felipe, I was thinking about like what I was saying before about like the cities where like, DC policy feels a bit more tangible. And I'm just thinking like this past month has just been such an exemplary thing for that for you with immigration in New York City. Yeah, so I was thinking the upsides and downsides of the beat. I think the first couple of years, to be honest, you're proving yourself to editors. I don't think the beat is as important the first couple of years personally, because 12 years later, I'm pitching editors that were assigning me breaking news 12 years ago, right? Which is pretty wild. So but they know me now as a features writer. I'm not seen to them as a breaking news writer. But I built up that trust with them doing that breaking news for a really long time. A lot of people at the Metro desk, Whitney's, a lot of people advice that have gone on to other things. And I did that kind of years of building up that trust while I was exploring kind of what I wanted to write about. And I think that's kind of confirms your kind of landscape of editors that can rely on you, which I think is so important in this industry. The upsides of the beat, I would say, yeah, echoing everything Felipe said. I mean, it's certainly, you just come up in the mind of editors, and I think that's really important. And I love when freelancers get to a point where the editors are assigning them rather than them having to pitch. It's a great place to be. But I would additionally say I kind of even the way you described me in my bio is like that. I've tried to kind of massage a kind of different term for how what I write about. Like when I first started covering New York City transit, it was covering transit infrastructure, subways, things like that. I would say I'm a transit reporter, and I don't really say that anymore because I'm focusing on the climate. I'm focusing on parks. I'm focusing on open space. I'm focusing on infrastructure, housing, and because all these things are interconnected, right? So to say I'm just doing transit, I didn't want to be pigeonholed into that kind of one field, because I'm also just like a human that's naturally curious about different things too, and I want to write about different things. And I've done housing stories, and I've done a lot of climate stories. So I've kind of changed my own messaging on how I present my beat to editors and to the public, to kind of generally fall under cities. And I think that took just I like this beat, but I want to broaden it out a little bit. I want to write about other things if I am able to. I think what's good about cities and immigration is that they're broad enough that you could do that, which is great. You can get super specific niches within both of those topics, and that could be your thing. But I think keeping it to that broader, but still, I can hyper focus on an issue if you want me to, I think is a good position to be in. I think what I was kind of lucky with earlier on in the career, when I was exploring those different beats, is the kind of historical narratives were kind of taking me around. It was criminal justice became the biggest story in America in 2015 and 2016, right? So I was kind of following that and seeing how that went. And also we were reckoning with Rikers Island here, the murder of Eric Garner. These were huge stories in New York City. And then we kind of lost focus in 2016. Trump became the main focus. So I was following where that would kind of go. And I've been lucky that I kind of jumped on those bandwagons to some extent, because I found them fascinating. But then once you kind of land and realize, okay, I got to see those things, this is what I kind of want to do after that. And I have that experience, and I can pull from that if I want to. But, once you kind of land on that kind of firm beat, then I think you're just on a better step for sure.
Yeah. Well, one thing that you'd also said when you were covering politics and you're like, I'm just not sure I'm cut out for that. Well, I mean, I think, I do talk to some students sometimes, and they're like, just tell me if my idea is a bad one, and it's sort of that idea of when do you cut the cord, or just be like, okay, I'm not coming to terms with that. It's sort of a squishy idea, but what is it that can you talk a little bit about that? What was that? Were you I don't want to cover Trump, or is it that you don't like being among a scrum of people trying to get the quote, or what was it for you?
For the 2016 campaign? Oh, I could tell you
for the being a political reporter.
Yeah, oh, I could tell you so many moments. 2016 was especially brutal. I think we all know for media it was an especially brutal year, right? But yeah, I think just seeing the bags under reporters' eyes on the campaign trail wasn't great. The way obviously the kind of MAGA crowd treated media was terrible, and that was really hard to get through as a reporter. I think I had to step up being with Vice because it had a kind of built-in trust amongst Trump supporters randomly, more than the New York Times and CNN does. But just feeling I think what kind of turns me off about I always kind of tell the story that like what turns me off about politics and national writing is that it's this like machine that you're just like adding content to. I mean, like I can't tell you how many like debate recaps. I mean, there's so many debates, it's insane. We're only on the second or third one. There's gonna be like 15 more. And you just kind of feel like you're adding to this like content machine in a lot of ways. Like everyone has that recorder, and you can only do so many interesting things with those quotes that you're all recording. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But what I often say is that like I didn't get many questions. People thought it was like, oh, that's interesting. You're covering the campaign. But when I started writing about the New York City subway, I got so many more questions from friends and family members about the New York City subway, and also just like America's infrastructure problem, than I ever did about politics. And I just thought that was like rewarding as a reporter, and also just like, there's some sort of disconnect here between what we know about our infrastructure systems and what readers do know, don't know. And I think that's really inspired me as a reporter to be like, I want to be the person that makes that more digestible to readers. And it's hard to do that with politics because it's just like everyone's trying to do that, and it's kind of a mess. But I respect the people that like do really long profiles, spend a lot of time with, like John Hendrickson with the thing with in the Atlantic with Vivek. Like I respect those folks a lot. It's just like not what I'm particularly keen and interested in, as as just like a writer.
Well, it's always
You
good.
know, and
So go ahead.
well, I was gonna say, I would also add that it's a good idea, especially like for folks that are now like in school or whatever, to sort of try your hand at different types of reporting, right? And different, not just different beats, but like different styles, right? And breaking news and maybe some like more analysis or perhaps like explanatory type things, or even investigative. And like I've done it all, I mean, like I've done every kind of thing. And it helps you also identify maybe you're also just kind of how best to use whatever natural skill sets that you have. And like I during the pandemic, for example, I started doing a lot of reporting on COVID spreading in ICE detention, and I did I investigated this private prison in Michigan for a little while, and I still reference those stories. I really enjoyed doing investigative work. It was I think a highlight of my career so far. However, I think I came to realize, after a while of doing that like I'm just like not like constitutionally an investigative reporter as much as I am maybe kind of like a more of an analytic, kind of like I'm very good at like understanding like policy and like kind of trying to prognosticate how it's going to play out, and sort of like weaving together all these sort of like historical contexts and all this kind of stuff. And like, I was less good at kind of the kind of an organization that you need to sort of really follow like like hunt down the ex-employees of the private prison company and stuff. And like it was interesting to do that work, and I enjoyed it, but like, and I hope to do some more of it at some point. But it was also kind of a learning experience of like, there's just people who are better at this than I am a little bit. And like that's fine. Like, I don't have to be the best person at like, every type of journalism. Like I can really try to sort of pick and choose just based on my natural proclivities and sort of like how I tend to work, like what sort of work is sort of best suited for me. And so I think like just kind of trying those different things is good, and sort of just seeing what sort of just fits best on you.
Yeah, totally. Well, I want to ask, both of you, well, I should say, there are a couple of questions in here. And so please feel free to ask questions, and we will get to the questions, and just, you type them in there, and I see them. So, if you are thinking of a question, just type it in there and we'll get to it. You both have said that you get to the point where they're contacting you. But there, like there's the beginning of that, and then the ending is like that the editors are contacting you for these stories, and that's like a really wonderful place to be. So I want to like move back to sort of the beginning of like how do you write a pitch in the beginning, and you have to write a more formal pitch. And Felipe, you had said that like you hear from people that it seems like a mysterious art, and in the Pitch Collective we talk a lot about what a pitch needs, and that you're like, actually, it's not really that mysterious. There are like elements that all pitches need. And I thought I'd love for you to talk about like when you were starting out, or maybe when you're starting out with a new publication. I'm assuming you're writing something a little more formal, and then we'll get to the point where like, how do you navigate the time whenever they're like just contacting you. But that's the place that I think a lot of writers want to get to, but you have to start out somewhere. And so can you talk about what do you include in a pitch? Or I guess when you're talking to students about writing in a pitch, but you feel like there's like clear elements that always need to be there.
Yeah, I mean, my strategy, I mean, what seems to me like the basic ingredients of a pitch is basically why this, why now, why you, and sort of a basic roadmap. So why this? Why is this subject interesting? And that also presupposes a certain awareness of the readership and style of the publication, which I think is something that gets overlooked. So the way I could be writing about the exact same subject, but the way that I'm going to pitch it to like the Washington Post is very different from how I'm going to pitch it to the Nation, right? They have different readerships, they have a different outlook and style, right? And so first of all, it's knowing the publication and knowing their coverage and what they've done and why they would be interested in this, how to frame that. So why is this subject interesting, and why is your iteration of this novel? So if this has been covered before, what makes this moving the story forward versus rehashing something? Is there a peg, right? Is there something happening? Is there knowledge that you have that's particular, which ties into the why you? I think like it's actually pretty important, especially when you're starting out, to try to establish why you're the person who should be writing this story. Because I mean, all these places have people on staff. They have their freelancers that they've worked with before. I mean, people sometimes complain that their ideas seem to get used by outlets without them actually being the the people commissioned to write them. I don't think that happens as much as people fear, but like what makes you the right person to write this job, to write this piece, right? Is it have you covered it before? Have you already talked to some people about it, right? That's a big plus, right? Did you already establish contact with a hard to reach source? Do you have some kind of personal experience with it? I think the way that experience is being regarded has shifted a lot in the last 15 years, where it's like, it's not necessarily seen as like, oh, you're biased, but like, you have an entry point here or a perspective that will kind of help us better tell the story. I think why now is important. So like, what makes this the right time to write this pitch? I mean, if it's an evergreen story, you kind of have to kind of establish why you think that it is, or if there's kind of some specific reason that now is the moment, right? There's this ruling that's coming down the pike, or the local parties are organizing around this, and it hasn't been very much covered, but I think it's going to be the next critical race theory in schools, and as kind of a kind of national local organizing strategy, whatever, right? Like, what is this? Why is this the moment? And then I think by basic roadmap, it's like the editor should be able to more or less envision the structure of the story from the get-go. So it doesn't mean that you have the story written. And I saw one question here that's like, oh, should you send a whole piece? No. Especially if you're starting out, editors are not going to read an entire piece that you're going to send. They don't have time for that, right? They want to skim and a pitch should be like 400 words tops, right? Like, I really think that brevity is your ally here, because if in that span of time you can establish all the answers to those questions, it means you can write succinctly and wasting anybody's time. But then give a sense of like, who are you maybe going to talk to? Even it doesn't have to be necessarily specific people, but I think I would have try to reach an academic who studied this issue, and perhaps an official in the Adams administration, and such and such person, and probably cover these 3 subjects, right? How has this played out in other cities, and blah blah blah. So like having some kind of like thing that the editor can like pick up and sort of like imagine where you're actually going to go with this, I think is crucial, right? You basically the most fundamental tenet here is that as much as you possibly can, you should take the guesswork out of this, right? You should do most of the work for the editor. The editor should be like more or less able to just say go, for it, right? As much as possible. Always at the end say, and here's my, I can be reached at this email, and here's my number. If you want to call me, I'm happy to talk it through, right? Always make sure that I think it's a good idea to establish that you're willing also to sort of, find the exact angle, that works for them. But, in as much as you possibly can, like take any kind of like guesswork out of it. Like they should know what you're writing about, why you're writing about it, why it's the right time, and sort of what steps you're going to take is kind of my basic recipe, obviously tweakable, for the publication and the story, but that's what I really think is like the non-negotiables of a successful pitch, particularly one with an editor that you don't know, right? I mean, it gets a lot easier once you sort of establish that rapport, but before you really are able to do that, that's really what you should be targeting, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean so another follow-up question to that is like some students ask me, at what point should they be pitching? Like, like I think the idea is that you don't want to put too much work into it if you don't know if it's going to run, but I also say, like, I think that's where the question is coming from students, but it's also important to know that you have an actual story. And so, you do need to probably like, do you make some calls? I mean, whenever you're more established, it's sort of different, but like at this point, do you make a bunch of calls? Like, you don't want to say, I'm going to be talking to these people. And then they're like, great, go for the story. And then you're like, actually, I can't get in touch with them. So at what point do you send the pitch whenever you have your idea? That's for you, Felipe, and then we'll talk to John.
Okay.
His.
Okay. Yeah, definitely what you just said is crucial, right? I mean, you don't want to overpromise, right? Because if you overpromise and underdeliver, that's what they're going to remember, not how great your pitch was, how distant it was maybe from, your final product was from your pitch. And so I would say that like you should be sure that there is a story there and that, there are sources that are accessible to you writ large. So, maybe the specific people you had in mind, you already established contact with, or it's sort of a situation where there are a plethora of sources available. If you're pitching a story where, for example, like you really need to have this one specific source, right? Or maybe a couple of people without whom the story falls apart, then you really need to make sure you've got that buttoned up before you send the pitch. And what I tell people too, I tell my students this is like, you should be ready for the editor. Like you shouldn't send a pitch and be like, okay, let me do some research. Like if the editor calls you 30 seconds after you send the email, you should be able to go immediately and start talking about like, the contours of the story that you're going to do. And like, you should already have done research prior, right? So at minimum, like if the editor is like gets your email and dials you, like you should be able to talk cogently about sort of the issue immediately. So that's also my advice, right? Like once you hit send, you should be ready to start doing that story.
Yeah, that's great advice. Yeah, it was like you get the call and you like hide in the bathroom or something. I'm not ready for this. But that's like a rule of thumb. John, what about you? What are the elements of a pitch that you're just like, I always have this?
It's funny because I've made the mistake of pitching an editor something that relied on one source and then that source didn't want to talk. And it was a real bind to find myself in for sure. It was early on in my career. And
how did you recover from that? I mean, you're like, I got someone else, or what happened?
Yeah, so I did the old bait and switch. I found another pitch to kind of fill in. It was for the New York Times and it was for a restaurant that I thought would have made a good neighborhood joint, which was an old Metropolitan column. And then the restaurant said no. And then I basically pitched another kind of really interesting place. And thankfully I'd worked with that editor a couple of times and they were like, okay, don't do that again, but this place sounds interesting. And it ended up being published. Yeah, not great. Definitely not a great look to go after. So I don't want to reiterate Felipe's points because they were all fantastic, and I would argue the exact same of what he said. The only thing I'll add to that is just absolutely reading the heck out of the outlet before you pitch them. For a number of reasons. The first is you got to know their style. If you're pitching a Vice story to the New York Times, it's going to fall flat, and you might not even get a response, or it'll be immediately clear you didn't do your research. So the style thing is really important, and starting to know what their style is and how they write and what they would kind of focus on. The second reason why I think reading, just really, really following a publication is so important is because there's going to be niches and there's going to be cracks in what they haven't covered, right? And as a freelancer, especially, the staff writers are going to get the like bread and butter. Let's say it's about Mayor Adams, like Eric Adams did this, the major news story. Like, for example, this last weekend, the big news was that Eric Adams was kind of absent during the flooding on Friday, right? Or until like 12 p.m. The staff writers are probably covering that story, right? But like if you found like where he was or why he happens to do this a lot, like the longer storm story that's like wasn't covered as much by the staff writers, and you know that because you read the publication so many times, that's a really important skill to have, and I think that shows that you're doing your research and doing your homework. You also do not want to get into a place. I mean, I've definitely helped a lot of folks with pitches where I was like, the publication you're pitching just did this story like a week ago, or something really similar. I'm having that situation right now with I'm working on a story that Gothamist did a pretty similar story to, and I noticed it when I was doing the research, and I made that clear to the editor, and we're trying to figure out a different way to go on this story. But thankful, like it came up in the negotiations over the story, like we don't want to go over tired ground here. So, just like, yeah, really familiarizing yourself with that publication, getting across to the editor that you care about it, you read it, you love it. Because I think that will show in your work, and that'll show in that, that to me is like part of reliability. And I think that's a really important point.
Yeah. And then there's like, I think I hear from students sometimes who do get something published, which is great. And then they're like, should I be pitching them like a bunch of stories right after this ends? And then, or if you get then there's the other scenario where you pitch someone, you actually hear back, it's a no. And then do you pitch again? And so like I've asked editors, I've talked to one editor, I remember, who said, like maybe wait a little bit before you pitch it like right away. But it's, I guess those are two different scenarios. If you've just gotten something published, you want to be like, how do you get to that point where you're the person they like get in touch with more often without sort of throwing spaghetti at the wall, or, like how do you navigate that? Because you want to create a relationship. And so it's like, there are things that you should and shouldn't do probably, but how did you navigate that? I guess we'll go Felipe, since we're going back and forth.
Well, I would say first and foremost that this is a very reputationally based industry, right? So, you can have a lot of, great work, but if you, once or twice, like, just like, fall down on a story and like, you really don't, you, for whatever reason, like, you pitch something that you can't deliver or whatever, and if it starts being known that you do that, right, it gets a lot harder for you also, because all these people talk and like all the, people move around. And so I would say, like, most of all, be careful and cognizant of sort of like what you can do, what you can't do. That doesn't mean overly cautious. I think there's something to the old maxim of like, say yes first and learn later. Particularly, if you pitch someone you're early on, and you do a story for someone and they're like, hey, can you do this other thing? And you maybe aren't like super sure that you're like on top of it, but it's something you could learn. Just say yes. Don't be so concerned that you're not going to be able to like get a handle on it, that you turn something down, because like it's a gift if the publication kind of wants to keep working with you, right? It's an important thing. I would say, like, essentially don't swamp editors. Editors generally are pretty busy. They get hundreds of emails, especially at larger publications, right? They might get 100 pitches in a week or something, right? Or more. And so, I would say that don't pitch for the sake of pitching. Like, ensure, like, the standards for sending a pitch never change. It doesn't matter if you want to send like more pitches. Like, if you don't have a story that works for the publication and that is worth pitching, don't pitch just for the sake of continuing to pitch, right? Like, if you need to take a few days to really try to nail down that next story, that's much better than just kind of like feeling like they're not going to forget about you, right? Like, especially if you did good work, you turned in clean copy on time. right? It's not like, 2 weeks later, they're like, who's this person, right? Like they're going to remember, right? And so I think that part of it is more important than, and I think that's why it's also good, especially if you're freelancing, to have a stable of publications that you can kind of alternate a little bit. Like, I when I was really freelancing full time, I was like, my kind of like main outlets were like the Intercept and the New Republic and the Baffler to an extent. And I would sort of pitch a one type of story to one, and then a different type of story to another, and sort of like, maybe like, yeah, like sort of alternate, right? Like, oh, this week I'll pitch the Daily Beast and the Nation, and the next week I'll pitch the New Republic, right? And sort of like try to have that, variety also. Because I mean, it lets you work with different editors and sort of like do different types of stories, but it's also a good way of not like seeming, perhaps too overeager with a particular publication, I'd say.
Mhm. What about you, John?
Yeah,
Anything to add?
that's a great point. I think the overeagerness is really, really important. Also, you want to be valuable to a bunch of different editors. And I think to Felipe's point, like I'd rather I'd rather have 3 really good pitches than like 10 mediocre ones. Because like that's what distinguishes you as like a serious journalist to be reckoned with, and just like a kind of someone who's just churning out stuff.
Yeah.
And that's very obvious in your pitches. You can tell when it's someone who's just churning out stuff, or like this is just like it's not a ton of value to them. Yeah, I would say like the kind of variety point. I always like having a roster, but then you start to narrow it down, right? Like I have like kind of 3 editors now who I primarily work with, maybe 4 that I've kind of like worked through over time, and I've kind of like, developed relationships with them. And like I think it's like when I was first starting out, I was like, I'm pitching anyone who will read me, right? Like I'll pitch whoever. I haven't been published anywhere, so let me just try as many different people. And then like you meet great editors, you meet editors that you don't really like working with that much. Like it is a two-way street, right? So there's some editors who I really enjoy and feel like they really get me, I get them, and we have a good working relationship, and I've stuck around with them. And then you kind of find that person at every outlet that you kind of build that relationship with over time. I've found that like as my career has gone on, I've gone from like pitching everyone under the sun to like really narrowing out to 3 publications or so. So right now it's primarily I've been writing for Bloomberg for a really long time, and been writing for the Times for a long time, and occasionally doing work for New York Magazine and Curbed. And it's like, and that kind of came from kind of pursuing those outlets and wanted to stick with them because they're 3 outlets I really think are great and want to work for. But I think that kind of took like finding the right person, who's the right person for me there, who's going to read my pitches, who's going to kind of get what I'm going for, rather than like, pitching someone who's completely on a different beat.
Yeah.
And I think that's strong because you can develop like very distinct streams of work with them that I think establishes you as a contributing writer at all those publications. And like I think it really establishes your body of work
Yeah.
as you start to build up your portfolio.
I mean, you're also like, just thinking about all the balls in the air that you have, especially in the beginning. And so I want to talk about 2 things. Well, one, like how many ideas when you were freelancing for several different publications, like how many ideas do you have going at once? And then I think this will sort of lead us also into like something that John, we talked about on the phone recently of just like, how else are you piecing together sort of, a way to pay the bills. So like how many, like, cause you can't have like 10 ideas like that you're actively working on at the same time. Did you just have a rule of thumb? And I'll have John and then Felipe can have this moment to think about what he wants to say, because we keep putting you in the hot seat in the beginning.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, Felipe, when you said when I was freelancing full time. Of course, like what you're doing now is different forms of freelance, right? Because you have specific positions, just like me. We're like we both have specific positions at different places that are like part time to almost full time that we've kind of cobbled together into this. Yeah, yeah. That we've kind of cobbled together into this kind of work.
Contemporary industry is, that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I would say, I mean, when I was really hitting the pavement, I was like, yeah, I was pitching probably 2 to 3 stories a week, 2 stories. And then doing breaking news coverage too. So I was kind of doing like getting assigned stuff and then also pitching stuff. And then as I kind of moved on, it was like, yeah, definitely like 2 to 3 pitches a week. Which is tough. That is tough to do. Especially because the speed of pitches does not always align with the rent payment for your apartment, right? So an editor that you like love working with could like take off for 2 weeks or like, go on vacation or, whatever. And then also like sometimes stories just take longer to report than you think, right? So like not all of them are going to rely on this like 1 week, 2 week schedule where I'm just like reporting and then writing. Some of them take longer. Some of them are like one event that only happens or something like sources aren't getting back to. They just like, you kind of always have to prepare for that. And I think that's when I was talking about with the different flows of writing and other things that you can kind of rely on to fill those gaps. But yeah, when I was throwing all the balls up in the air, definitely every day was different, and I was pitching a lot of different editors.
What about you, Felipe?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think that I don't think there's anything wrong with, for example, and I know a lot of people who do this who like are, writing and then also they are, like working at a restaurant or doing, X, Y. And like, I think there's like this notion of like, oh, well, then you're not like really doing like that. No, like you could be doing perfectly good work while, having another subsistence job, right? And I mean, it's a question of time management, ultimately, whether you can, do those things at once. But, as a concept, there's nothing wrong with that. If you do want to do full-time freelancing really as kind of an endeavor that pays the bills, what I did and what I recommend is having kind of always be working, and like it does, you do have to balance that out, because I mean there's really worm into your brain that like if you're like having a cup of coffee, you're like, why am I not working right now? And you have to resist that a little bit, because you have to be a person otherwise as well. But like I would have like a story that I'm doing this week that is like a quick hit about something, right? And then I'm also simultaneously I have sort of an analytic piece that's like more of on a 2 week schedule, right? So I'm calling a few people and I'm doing this 1,200 word piece over a couple of weeks, and then I'm also making calls for this like months long thing that I'm doing, of this like this prison investigation or whatever, right? Like and sort of like simultaneously doing these different types of reporting throughout the day. So my days were structured in such a way that I would like pitch every week, like a few stories a week probably, and then it'd be like, well, I'm doing this essay for the Baffler, and so I don't really need to do a lot of reporting. I'm doing a little bit of research, and maybe I'm calling one or two people, but it's more so like sort of like my perspective and some, and then I'm doing this like piece for the New Republic that's more like reported analysis on this other thing, and then I'm doing this investigation, and so sort of staggering things like that, such that you're kind of always working on things, but they're kind of things of different involvement and length, because you don't, I think you want to avoid also getting caught in kind of the churn of like just doing a lot of stories that perhaps you're not necessarily that interested in, but you just need to keep the kind of meat grinder going. And sort of what really does set you apart, I think, is kind of breaking news, writing about things off the beaten path, doing interesting things that often require a little more time. And so I do think it's important to have that set aside of like, okay, I'm going to dedicate, even if you have to set a number like X hours this week to this kind of longer term story I'm doing, to ensure that you're kind of like keeping up with some of the more, I guess, like you could call it the impactful work, or just kind of like the things that are, you want to do to put you more on the map, right? As kind of like someone who's worth reckoning with in the industry. And yeah, that just tends to be things that kind of take a little bit longer. So having the kind of, I call them sometimes like the burners, right? It's like the front burner and the middle burner and the back burner, kind of having different dishes on all those, cooking at once is I think a good strategy.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, we would talk about that when I was an editor at the magazine. You're like, what's the next day story? what's the like, 3 or 4 day story out, and then what's the longer term analysis piece that we would be running for a week or two. And so like editors are thinking in that same way. So I want to just do a couple like lightning round questions that I think that you could probably answer pretty quickly, but they're questions that I get a lot. And then I'm going to start going through the questions from the attendees. So what do you use as a subject line of your emails when you're sending a pitch? I get that a question a lot, and I have like spent time with students thinking through, like sometimes they're really hard to come up with, but do you guys have a go-to subject line that you use?
I always do pitch, M dash, because I mean, I want to make it clear that it's like a pitch, and then like 6-word encapsulation of the story that's very descriptive. So for example, I literally am right now looking at my email just to see what like stuff that I've sent recently, like pitch, where is the accounting on asylum seeker spending, right? And so, I'm talking about the issue that I'm covering, but also what my angle is. So, this pitch was around like, we're saying that the city is spending X amount on this, and we have these projections at future. Do we have those projections? What are they rooted in, right? Which was a story that I think I ended up doing for Hellgate at some point in the near term. And so, for me, it's always kind of like that, like pitch, here's what the story is about and like the subject that I'm covering, right? It's kind of what I try to do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
John, do you do the same?
Yeah, same. Pitch sometimes in all caps, and then usually just like same thing, colon, quick kind of situation. But it really depends on the editor. I would say like if it's someone who I've worked with a long time, not to say that I'm like, sending them like a one sentence, like, are you interested in this? But like sometimes it's just a bit quicker where I'll just like email them directly or, kind of get right to the point. But typically I would say pitch in the 6-word encapsulation is the formula.
The 6-word encapsulation, I totally agree, but sometimes those 6 words are so hard to figure out. Okay, another question is, so a lot of places have rates that are set, and we talked about this on our phone call the other day. Do you accept the rate? Do you always push back? What do you suggest about the payment?
When do you suggest it, or when do you ask?
So when do you ask for more, I guess is the question. When do you accept and when do you ask for more?
For me, that's totally concurrent with the amount of work that's being asked. Like if it's a long story that's going to take a lot of legwork, and you're offering me like, $100 or $200, it's like going to be really hard for me to swallow that. And then at the same time, like I don't want to get to a point where I'm doing like a reduced fee amount of work just to make it happen, because I think that's just like not good on anyone's end. But typically you have these, outlets have set policies, right? So I'll do that in occasion if it's like a new outlet that's just getting started and I want to do something for them. I think that's really, I'll maybe want to do that sometimes. But if it's like, sometimes outlets have set policies for word count and they only pay by word, right? So that's kind of hard to wiggle out of. I think the most important thing early on is just making clear what the fee is. And I think this is why, to me, not sending the entire piece is really important, because when you send the entire piece, you really undercut your value quite a lot, because you're just like, here's everything that I did. And then an editor can kind of just like put a price tag on that pretty quickly, when like the whole point of a pitch and the whole point of the 6-word encapsulation is that you're trying to ring them in, right? You're trying to get them interested. So like if I'm reading pitch, where did the accounting, what's the accounting behind the asylum seekers, like as asylum seeker spending, as Felipe just said, that would make me want to open up the email, right? It brought me in. And then the pitch ideally should make me want to see the story. But when you kind of offer all that straight up, like, and you kind of put it on a silver platter, you kind of just like lost all your cards to some extent, right? And I think that's like, however we want to put it, like there is a power dynamic between writers and editors. It is transactional, however you kind of cut it. And I think it's important not to like undercut or undervalue that work. But for me, the most important thing is just the transparency. Like, here's what it is. Go out and do it. This is the fee. I think that's the most important thing, squaring away what it is early on and not at the end of the process. Because you would never do that with any, like, it's like a Facebook marketplace purchase. Like like if you went to the person's house and they're like, how much is it now? You know, like you
Yeah.
wouldn't buy anything like that. And I think you need to keep in mind like that, those like sensibilities. But we can get intimidated by writers and editors, right? We can get intimidated in those situations, which I get.
Yeah.
But I think you shouldn't see it as an embarrassment or a humiliation or like, I don't know, being stingy by asking those questions. You know, I think it's that to me is the sense of someone who has a lot of confidence in their writing.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, my philosophy is doesn't hurt to ask for more. I mean, you know, like worst they can say is no, and then you're like, okay, fine, I'll take it. Right. But you know, I've had so many circumstances where somebody was like, hey, you know, we're thinking 500 for this. I'm like, I'm thinking 600, and they're like, okay, you know, like I mean, it literally like just like those extra 10 seconds is like, you know, got me the extra money, and a lot of these budgets are flexible, right? And obviously, like it also is commensurate with like kind of um your experience and and sort of like, you know, what you're kind of bringing to the table. But the other thing I want to really emphasize is that, you know, if the scope of the work transforms, or if there's, you know, something that would require that would reasonably, you know, have a sort of an additional fee, like it's your work. Like you need to put a price tag on that. So if you agreed on 1,500 words and there's all these edits and they're like, oh, you know, you know, you're looking like you're going to be pushing, you know, 2,200 or something. Return, you know, be like, I'm done working until we agree to you know, an additional fee. Or if they're like, oh, can you take some pictures? Sure, I'll take some pictures for $200. You know, like
Yeah.
you shouldn't, you know, sell yourself short here just because you want to get that byline, you know. And like, I'm not saying like burn any bridges, but like standing your ground, I think like no one's going to see that as a, you know, as a black mark on you, right? Especially if you have ground to stand on, right? Oh, you know, you want me to do all this extra work, then you know that I am doing labor for you for
Yeah.
money, right? And like, and so I just want to also make that point, right? I see a lot of people that are like, well, you know, and it ended up taking 3 months more than we planned, and you know, it ended up I added 800 words, and I'm like, well, you know, then that is more work, right? You did something beyond the original scope of the agreement. So that's my 2 cents on that too.
Amen.
Yeah. Well, I have a question here that's along these lines. Could you give us, I mean, I know it completely ranges, but someone is asking how much do you get compensated per story? I think it would be helpful to know like what's a range. And I know, and Felipe, you had said this when we were on the call the other day, and I know this from where I've worked too, is that sometimes the bigger publications pay less. But can you give a sense of like how much you might get paid for a story?
I mean, reported story, you know, 12 to 1,500 words, you know, I would expect in the range of 4 to 500, you know, for something like that. I mean, if it's something longer, you know, more in-depth reporting. So some of the stories that like, you know, I was doing for the Intercept that required much more legwork was closer to like $1 a word, you know, which is not typical. But you know, if it's sort of an investigative story and like it's like you're the only person who's doing this one story and you have the sources and the contacts, right? Like there's a premium on that, right? There's the more particular the story is to you, the more expertise you bring, the more, you know, you should sort of value that work. If it's sort of an opinion piece, you know, 800 words, like, you know, 300 to 50 is fine. If it, you know, it'll take you a day to research and write, right? Like I think that's reasonable. I don't think you should almost ever take less than like 200 for almost anything. I mean, unless it's kind of a situation like John mentioned where, you know, it's your buddies who just start a new publication, whatever, right? Like I think it's a slightly different circumstance in that case. But you know, like even the administrative work that you're putting in, pitching and sort of like, you know, reading the contract and sending the invoice like is worth something, right? So there's kind of a floor, I think, to what you should really reasonably expect for anything, even a short piece. Does that make sense?
Anything to add, John?
No, I think you captured the range I was going to say. A lot of it depends on the publication for sure. The Times has a pay per word. You know, Bloomberg has kind of like a range, some of them are set budgets, some of them are a bit more flexible. And then I would say, if it helps, to put like a price tag on your hours, right? So like every hour, let's say my work is valued at $30 an hour and I'm putting in 10 hours of work on this story. If that's easier for you to compute it like that, then go for it. I got to a point with some of those outlets I mentioned before where I have a contract that says I make X number of dollars on a story, which is really nice because it's in writing what they have to pay me, which is great. That's not going to be the case everywhere, especially when you're just getting going. Felipe, I think we're probably both guilty of this early on in our career where we took less than $200 for stories because we didn't know any better. And I think a big problem in media, and I think it's gotten a lot better, thankfully, than when we were students, is that we undervalued labor for a really long time, right? And this is how we got unpaid internships for so long. And what we're seeing with the writer's strike in Hollywood is a similar thing where their labor was undervalued. And I think because there's so much legacy in media, you get really intimidated by a certain publication or intimidated that your career will just implode if you complain. That's how that labor was undervalued for so long. And I think thankfully people are waking up to that. Thankfully it's, those things are kind of, not happening as much. And I think editors understand the kind of value of freelancers a lot better than they used to, particularly because freelancers are almost the majority now. So it's you can't really undervalue their labor. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really important part of getting across your value as a writer, is understanding that point that this was an industry that has a bad labor history where we undervalued that for a long time. And I think making that clear that you won't be taken for granted. You're doing a lot of work. This is not easy to ask anyone, is a big part of her growth as a writer for sure. But definitely guilty of taking really bad fees early on because I just didn't know any better and was this is a great example. So when I was doing breaking news for publications, I was never told by any editor that getting to the news scene is part of your hourly rate. And sometimes I was going places that were an hour and a half away. But no one ever told me that, right? The minute you get that call and you start running somewhere, your clock's ticking. I would basically only bill the minute I got there and when I followed the story. And I left hundreds of dollars on the table for years because no one told me that. No one told me to get somewhere as part of your hourly rate. You paid hourly for breaking news. And that's something that you learn yourself. I think I was told by another stringer, another breaking news writer that what are you talking about? You don't bill for your hours. There's a lot of that
the calculator starts going.
Yeah, and I was what? Are you kidding me? 22-year-old John was are you kidding? No, but I think a lot of that is generational wisdom that gets passed down. A lot of it's on the editor to make that clear. But also for you to have that kind of, just like what Felipe was saying about feeling comfortable and strong enough to ask for more, asking for clarity, asking for transparency and everything. That's a lot of times for you to do the taking rather than someone else.
Yeah. I'm going to go through, we have 15 minutes. So I just want to go through these questions real quick. Is there a story that you published that was rejected several times before being accepted? If so, what made it work in the end? If not, is there a story you'd love to write that you haven't found an outlet for? And why do you think you're facing this challenge? That's a good question.
I was thinking about that because I saw the question earlier. I know it's happened. I can't really recall the specific story. It's been a couple, but that I pitched around to a few different outlets before somebody took it. Sometimes it's as simple as, whoever, I pitched first, they were already doing something along those lines, or, they had a staff person that was, they just kind of didn't really understand, how it fit into their publication strategy. Sometimes, you'll get actionable feedback, somebody will say, I just think that this is too broad, or I think, and on occasion you can work with the editor to refine the pitch, but for whatever reason it doesn't work out. You can still take that feedback and sort of refine the next pitch that you send to the other outlet. But it's definitely happened at least twice or three times maybe, where I pitched something to 4 outlets and the fourth one took it or something. And I would also say that if you have a pitch rejected, you're not done. That's not like it. Like, unless, it's like rejected offhand because like you just didn't do a good job with the pitch, and you have to go back to the drawing board. But just because a pitch is rejected doesn't mean that like that's it. Like you move on to the next thing, right? It's perfectly fine. It's perfectly fine to go and sort of seek it out, with other outlets that like, maybe are more amenable to it because of their like own editorial voice and style, right? That like maybe they're actually like a better choice in the end. That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the other question too is like, what if you keep like, at what point are you like, okay, this is not going to work? There is like pitching and pitching and pitching, and then you're like only focused on this one idea. Um, like
That's a
when
good
do you
point.
just call it? I guess.
Yeah, if you feel like you're really wasting time or like you're not making progress on other stories because you're so focused on that one, that's not a great. That's not a. That's not. That shouldn't be a. That should be a clear sign that it's time to either pause it and not toss it. I don't think you should toss any stories, to be honest. You should just like leave it be. Come back to it later.
Yeah.
Um,
Because
I
there's something that drew you to it in the first place. So there's like,
yeah.
you're honing your light bulb, I guess, and so like maybe put it away and be like, oh, like a year later, you might be like, oh, this idea, now this is the time for this piece.
Yeah. Yeah. I see part of that question is there a story you'd love to write that you haven't found an outlet for? Why do you think you're facing this challenge? Yeah, I've been thinking of one that I've pitched, but like I pitched in numerous places, but got rejected. I mean, it's definitely happened. I know for a fact it's happened. And then like never got to write about that restaurant that I couldn't get the source for. Even though they gave it to Pete Wells, a restaurant critic in the end. He got to write about it because he's Pete Wells. And I am not. But yeah, a story I've actually wanted to write about for a long time. I have this constant story log at all times that's like what I'm working on now. I have it literally says back burner to Felipe's terminology. I have like a back burner and then ongoing, which I guess is the front burner. Yeah, and I've wanted to do this story for a long time about my hometown in Floral Park, which is on the border of Queens and Nassau, and about like how much it's changed since I've grown up there and how it's kind of incredible, like New York City change because it's half the towns in Queens, half the towns on Long Island and Nassau County. But do like a kind of returning home piece through the lens of food because there's been so many new cuisines that I never grew up with that have popped up, specifically South Indian. And like do it through the lens of food of what's formed there, and also just a story about like the suburbs changing pretty dramatically in America. I still don't know how to pitch it right, but I know there's something there, and I've been thinking about it for a long time. I have a couple that I'm just like figuring out how to post it. I want to write a lot more about Long Island because I'm from there and I think it's a fascinating place. And I like because I don't live there, I always feel this like weird imposter syndrome about like me writing about it. So I have all these random ideas just like kind of scrawled on this like document that I have.
Yeah, I love the idea of just like always writing down these ideas because they're it's percolating in your mind. Okay, how do you approach potential sources if you don't know where the article will be published, or if you plan on publishing the article on a personal blog? How do you establish credibility as a newbie journalist?
This is like one of the biggest issues students in my class
Yeah,
face.
the students ask me this question a lot too. Because it's tough. You're like, hi, I'm a student. I want to interview you. And then, so like, what did you guys do?
I mean, I think this one also is kind of there's two sides to the coin because sometimes there's people who like won't talk to like if a New York Times reporter, dials and asks questions about X or Y, they're not going to answer. But if you're a student, they might be more inclined because it's sort of, especially if you can present it as like, I'm actually genuinely interested in, and this goes for like, all kinds of professional work too, but like, I actually really want to know, about this thing. And like, I would really appreciate it. Like, if they can feel like they're helping you, it can often be interesting. Conversely, also just like, if you think you might pitch it to, an outlet, you might get it published. I mean, you don't want to promise anything that isn't, kind of settled and you haven't agreed to, but you can say like, I've written for these outlets before. These are the types of outlets I think I'll pitch the story to. I want to do some research on it, really kind of nail something down. and then I'll sort of keep you abreast of it, of sort of, but like I intend to like pitch various outlets, and sort of um like I'm not gonna like put it in a file and forget about it, right? Or like this is a topic I will be covering, and so even if this particular story maybe doesn't get published, I'm kind of interested in continuing to cover this, and sort of like kind of having this be part of my repertoire, and really getting the word out there. And I think like I always tell my students that flattery is a good way of securing sources. I love the word insight. Every time I'm like cold reaching out to somebody to try to get them to talk to me, I always say that I would just benefit so immensely from their unparalleled insight, and like if you kind of butter people up a little bit as well, it definitely helps.
I think that, yeah, like sometimes with students, yeah, somebody might be more inclined to talk to you because you're a student, but I think it's also important to be like, be like, oh, I'm writing this for class, but I do plan on public, like I do want to pitch it somewhere. So like making it clear, because you don't want someone to be like, oh, well, this is just for a class assignment, and then like say things and then they're like, wait, this is published. So it's like, but I think leaning into the fact that, like I love that word insight too. John, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, this happens all the time. I mean, even I just had the students in the class go out and do like man on the street interviews last week or 2 weeks ago. And the minute they said it was for a class, people were willing to talk to them because it felt like it was like ethereal, like it didn't matter that much, right? And I think that inclusion of, I mean, the man on the streets were its own thing, but like, I think that inclusion of like, I plan to pitch this. I'm kind of just like filling out the story. I do plan to pitch this. I think is really, really important. And I think, yeah, the two sides of the coin there being like what you were saying, Felipe, about, if you need to get a quote from the mayor's office for your story, right, that you're working on, like it's going to be hard to get, their press office to respond if you say like, it could be pitched as for a newspaper. Like, I don't know. But having confidence is like, I do plan on pitching this to major news outlets. You'll just probably evoke a much more, serious response than like, I'm not sure yet. And then that would leave a hole in your story of what like you're reporting on. But this is a consistent problem. Also, not hearing back from sources because of that is a huge problem. And it's something that I think student journalists really, I mean, I struggled with that as a student too. I wish I was more clear back then, saying specifically like, I have full intent to publish this somewhere. And, you can even include some outlets you're looking at if even that's helpful. But it might be tough to do that, but that's something that like could maybe get more of an answer.
Another little tip on that is like, it always helps to kind of like establish maybe who else you're talking to, especially if it's somebody that'll disagree with them. So, oh, well, if you can't talk, that's too bad. I'll just talk to your opponent and, get their insight. I had a city council member who shall remain unnamed ask me recently, did you talk to my asshole opponent? And, with the implication being that would be an affirmative response would make it much likelier for him to give me a call. And so, that's just another little trick.
I love that. I mean, it's true. Like you're like, well, I've talked to these people, and then they're like, oh, I want to be part of that conversation too. Okay. Is it okay to ask editors of publications if you can cover a story for them in hopes of seeing if they can give you something instead of potentially pitching something and failing?
I'd say no.
I have an answer, but yeah.
No, because you're not bringing anything to the table, really, right? If you're just like, hey, I'm available, I mean, that's great, but I even a few short pitches, right? Like included in that, like, like here are some ideas of something I could do, and if none of that sort of is in your wheelhouse, and I'm also happy to participate in your coverage in any way. Like, having that's fine at the end of a pitch, but I wouldn't send it on any kind of a pitch. No.
I have a kind of mixed response with that. I would say unless you have a super specific access point that like is quite valuable, that no one else has, like to be like, hey, I'm available for the Trump trial. Like, I'm sure the editor has tons of people that are, I mean, like it's the biggest story right now in the city or like the biggest news event today. But if like you're offering a specific niche that like could maybe A, just like get you above everyone else, or B, save the editor money. That's also a big part. So I'll give an example that kind of I think of, for what kind of invoked me to mention this. So in 2016, me and my partner went down to Brazil. Felipe, like you were mentioning Brazil, we went down to Brazil for 3 months during the 2016 Summer Olympics. My partner's from Brazil, her family's from Rio. They have they live down there, so we lived with them for 3 months. And the month before we went to every single editor we ever worked with and said, we're going to be in Rio for the next 3 months. My partner speaks fluent Portuguese. I speak conversational Portuguese, and we will be down there at no cost to you. You're not putting us up, and by doing that for that month, the amount of stories we got in those 3 months, I mean, we were writing nonstop for a bunch of different publications because we were like people down there that they knew, and they didn't have to pay a fixer. They didn't have to pay a journalist they didn't know. And we could speak the language, which really helps. So that's such a specific niche situation.
Yeah.
You
And
know,
you kind of need to establish some credibility first.
yeah,
Right.
it takes some legwork to do that. I think it's helpful if, like you're from a certain state and that state's in the news, and you might not have like a kind of one up on it because you're like, you're from the town where it happened or something like that. That could be a niche that kind of gets you in there, but it's super select situations. And I think always to your point, Felipe, we were always kind of like needling some pitches to them at all times. But I think that kind of access point was so specific enough that it worked for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we have one last question, and then I have the question that everyone asks me all the time. So first, is it possible for people primarily working in multimedia journalism, so TV and radio, to pitch print stories? And do editors only look at published print clips, or would multimedia clips work too?
From what I know, I mean, from what I've heard from editors, there shouldn't really be like an impediment to you doing so, right? I mean, if somebody reached out to me and they were like, hey, I've done, a bunch of stories, radio stories for NPR, and I want to write for, I mean, the only thing that I would be assigning, right, maybe stuff for the daily news opinion section, but whatever, right? Like, let's say it happens. I wouldn't consider that to be like irrelevant experience. I think it's sort of the same principles apply. I don't think it's like, it might be a little bit have a higher bar slightly, but I certainly wouldn't say that it's like this big obstacle. No.
Yeah, I think it's important for the pitch to show that you can write too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I think it's the only kind of like catch-22 that you get in. It's like, I don't know if this is the question you're going to ask in a little bit, Whitney, but like the catch-22, like I need the clips to get the internship, but I need the internship to get the clips, kind of catch-22. Which comes up so much, but with multimedia, it's tough because like you want the print clips, but like you kind of have to show an editor that you can write too. Like I think multimedia clips could bolster your case because you could show your versatility as a reporter, and that's amazing. But at the same time, I do think the editor would probably want to see that you've written something that you could actually like put together a piece, because that's at the end of the day like what you're promising you can do. But that's hard, right? Because how do you do that unless you get the trust of an editor? I do think this is why like student newspapers are super important. I think this is why portfolios are super important, because you can show that work without being like published in a kind of different way. Yeah, but it's definitely a catch-22 moment that I think folks struggle with.
Okay, in our last 2 minutes. So the question I get all the time is how long do you wait after you've sent your pitch to follow up? How long do you guys wait? Like that, I get that more than anything else, probably.
Really?
I love that.
Do you have a rule of thumb?
I would say it's entirely downstream of what the story is, right? So like if it's like a story where it's like this is like something is breaking and like, this story to be relevant needs to run tomorrow, then, I will follow up like 2 hours later, right? Or less, right? If it's something that it's like we could publish this next month, no problem. My general rule of thumb is about a week. So if it's sort of I send something on a Monday, maybe like I'll follow up the next Monday, right? I try not to keep it at under a week, because people are busy and they're like, but I think like after a week, it's like you're starting to get into the territory where they probably forgot about it or, whatever. And so like, I think it's a good spot. I also think like on occasion, if it's like a really super time sensitive story that like needs to be published, I've done this again, like, it really needs to be that kind of scenario and you have to let them know, but like pitch 2 publications at once or something. Say, I need to publish this immediately. It's like super fresh. I want to let you know I'm sending this to a few editors and seeing if there's any interest, right? Like, I think sometimes people get skittish about that, but you can do that only in that type of circumstance, though. Never just like send a pitch to someone without saying that, and then send it to multiple outlets. Because then if 2 of them say yes, then you have to explain now to one of them that you're not going to do it, and that reflects pretty badly on you. But about a week in general, if it's not a super time sensitive thing, it's my rule of thumb.
Do you do a week and then you follow up, and then if you don't hear, do you wait one more week and then follow up, or like
I'll wait maybe like 3 or 4 more days, right? Like I don't give it a whole other week, I'll just be like, hey, usually like the second follow-up is like, I'm going to start pitching other outlets unless you're interested kind of deal. In which case, if they don't respond, then they've been told that you're going to pitch other outlets. So it's fine if you do,
What about you, John? Do you do the same?
Yeah, that's pretty I mean, that's pretty accurate to what I would say as well. And then like, yeah, like if it's super relevant, like again, if it was something related to like what happened over the weekend with the flooding in the mayor, then like, yeah, of course you would want to pitch that. Like you'd have to follow up with Sunday or Monday because like we're gonna start talking about something completely different in 2 days. If it's something that like, this also goes to the making the income part of it, right? Like you don't really have the time to wait 3 weeks or 4 weeks for an editor to get back to you, right? Like you're trying to make your rent or you're trying to like live in New York City as a human being, right? Like you kind of like can't give it this really long tail, right? Like it just like it'll be really hard to write if you're giving every story 4 weeks to land somewhere. And I think a week with the 3 or 4 day follow-up after that is the perfect medium for that. There's some other ideas where I'm like, I know this is like a slow burn evergreen story. I'm not going to chase it crazy, where I'll let it float if I'm not super depending on that story to like, like it's not the main focus of mine right now. But generally speaking, I think like it's also really worth reminding yourselves that like no response does not mean no. It also does not mean that like an editor doesn't care about you. I mean, when you could speak to this, you receive the amount of emails is insane that you're receiving every day. I get panic from emails. It's like I can only imagine being an editor. So I've always like remind yourself that like don't read into it. They probably forgot. Like I'm getting to the point now, this is crazy. I've gotten to the point in a career where folks are following up with me, and I never thought I'd get to that point. I'm like, I know I always swear I would. Yeah. Even though people have been, I'm just like forgetting to respond to things, which I've never like, it's not a good habit. But anyway, just like that point where like, not reading into it, don't see it as a no, but also don't like hinder yourself by doing that, right? Like be versatile, be ready to pitch it somewhere else. The point about Felipe, about pitching the 2 outlets at once, is always something I think about because students always ask me that question about like, can I pitch it to numerous outlets? I think it's so important. The transparency, I think, is the most important part, that you're pitching it to numerous outlets. Because I've recommended, this was years ago, I recommended a writer to a publication, and they pitched them a story, and they had published a very, very similar story for another publication and didn't tell the editor that, and the editor found it, and like it reflected not well on anyone involved in that situation. I was pretty upset about it, but like that could happen, right? Like you have to be like, people will read what you're writing. They'll find it if you copied something you've done and pitched it somewhere else, or and I think that's something that like those editors have been journalists too, and we'll figure something out. And I think that's an important part. I think breaking news, that's a specific thing, but I try to keep it to the one outlet, focus on them, then pivot, focus on another.
And also understanding what, like, sometimes students are like, this is really timely. And then I'll think, oh, it's timely because they just did the interview and it feels really urgent to them. So like sort of thinking like outside of yourself of like, what does timely actually mean? That's like an important thing to think about too. Well, thank you. We're out of time, but thank you guys. Thank you both so much for your time. And this was really helpful. And thanks to the attendees for coming. And thank you so much.
Thanks,
Thank
Whitney.
you. Hopefully this was helpful for some folks.
It definitely was. Thank you. Great. Bye-bye.
Have a good
Bye.